The sound did not register as a scream or a crash, but as a vast, collective silence. It was 2:15 a.m., and for the last 4 hours, the express to Edinburgh had battled the worst blizzard the Scottish Highlands had seen in a decade. The rattling, rhythmic clatter that had been the train's pulse, the comforting vibration that promised movement and purpose, had abruptly ceased. The steel body of the luxury sleeper, now entombed in a blinding white storm, rested stationary upon the dizzying height of the Frostbridge viaduct. In cabin C1, the silence was thicker, heavier, tainted with the smell of expensive cognac and a sharper, coppery scent. Lord Justice Alastair Finch, known professionally as the hanging judge, lay sprawled across the Persian runner, his face a mask of pale astonishment fixed upon the brass luggage rack above. His silk dressing-gown was saturated a startling, violent red. A young porter, George, stood over the body, his knees knocking against the mahogany paneling. He had been sent to retrieve the judge's late-night brandy request, but the key, left in the outer lock as was the judge's habit, had refused to turn. George had hammered, then panicked, eventually summoning the train manager, who used his master key. The door, once opened, had revealed a paradox. The judge was dead, stabbed repeatedly and viciously. The window of the cabin, though frosted over, was clearly sealed and bolted from the inside. The connecting door to the next cabin, occupied by the elderly Countess of Ashworth, was likewise bolted. The outer door, now ajar, had been locked only moments ago, the key lodged on the inside mechanism. The weapon vanished. The killer vanished. The only sound now was the wind, a colossal moan across the viaduct, and the soft, measured tap-tap-tap of a small, polished walking stick approaching down the corridor. Hercule Poirot emerged from the swirling curtain of the storm's shadows, impeccably dressed even at this hour, his greatcoat and scarf entirely untouched by the hysteria that gripped the onlookers. He paused at the threshold of cabin C1. His bright green eyes, sharp as surgical steel, swept over the tableau, the locked door, the bolted window, the slain judge, the appalled porter. He took a slow breath, inhaling the air, the fear, and the lie. "Voila," he murmured, addressing the stunned train manager. "It is a murder most impossible, is it not? A crime without a criminal. The curtain is up, and already the stage is set for a monumental failure of logic." He did not step inside. Instead, he raised a single, well-manicured finger. "First," he stated, his voice calm amidst the rising panic, "we must establish the facts. Was the judge loved? No. Was he wealthy? Undoubtedly. But tell me this, when exactly did the music stop?" The train manager looked helplessly from the dead man to the living legend. "When did the killing happen, Monsieur Poirot?" "No," Poirot corrected, his gaze intense. "When did the train cease its movement? Because if the train is stationary on a viaduct, and the window is locked, then the killer did not vanish into the night. They vanished into the theatre of our suspicion." Chapter 1. The train manager, a nervous man named Mr. Finch, no relation to the victim, he insisted, mopping his brow, led Poirot to the dining carriage, which was now serving as an impromptu interrogation room and a hub of rising fear. "I have taken the liberty, Monsieur Poirot, of confiscating the keys to all other compartments," Mr. Finch reported, visibly relying on the small Belgian for strength. "The police, they cannot reach us until the lines are cleared, perhaps 6 or 8 hours. We are entirely alone." Poirot surveyed the assembled passengers, a mix of the elite, the intellectual, and the distinctly theatrical. He noted their expressions with clinical detachment, the frozen shock of the Countess, the defensive impatience of a young industrialist, and the calculating coolness of the judge's private secretary. "A magnificent isolation, my friend. Perfect for the little gray cells," Poirot commented, adjusting his scarf. "But before the whys, we must establish the hows. The impossible crime, it demands an anatomical dissection." Poirot returned to cabin C1, allowing only Captain Hastings, a fictional necessity for this narrative, if he were here, to observe. Since Hastings was absent, Poirot mentally addressed his methodology to the trembling Mr. Finch. "Observe, Finch. The elements of the impossible crime are simple. The victim is here. The motive is everywhere. The method is invisible. The door, you said, was locked from the inside." "Yes, monsieur. The key was in the lock. George the porter could not turn it from the outside." Poirot crouched, examining the keyhole. "The key must be turned to unlock, yes? If the killer had the key, they would lock the door and take it. But the key is still here. This suggests one of three things. The killer is a ghost, the killer left through a wall, or the killer never left the room at all." He then examined the window, a heavy, double-paned affair. The locking mechanism was old but secure, the bolt covered in undisturbed frost. "No entry, no exit," Poirot confirmed. "Yet the judge is stabbed multiple times. A crime of passion, or a deliberate attempt to convey a message of rage." Poirot then began the formal introduction and assessment of the suspects, establishing their direct relationship, and thus their immediate motive, to the controversial Lord Justice Finch. Lady Beatrice Harrington, the Countess of Ashworth, an elderly, sharp-tongued aristocrat who occupied the adjacent cabin, c. 2. Her son had been ruined by a judgment Finch delivered only months prior. Mr. Silas Vance, the industrialist, a self-made millionaire known for his ruthless business tactics. Finch had recently blocked a massive, environmentally destructive venture Vance was pushing through Parliament. Vance looked coiled with suppressed anger. Mrs. Evelyn Sharp, the widow, a strikingly beautiful woman in deep black mourning. Her motive was the most public. Finch had refused to grant her an appeal in a lawsuit that led to her husband's bankruptcy and subsequent suicide. Mr. Julian Thorne, the secretary, the judge's long-suffering private secretary. Thorne possessed the motive of proximity and enduring abuse. He had served the judge for 20 years and, according to his own weary admission, hated him. Poirot held the bloody key from the outer door in his gloved hand. "Let us begin with Mr. Thorne. You hated your employer, yes? A fine motive. But you were the last to see him alive. Tell me, what was the state of the cabin when you left him at 11:30 p.m.? Thorne, pale but composed, adjusted his spectacles. "He was drinking cognac and reading a new book. He was expecting no one. I made sure the outer door was locked, a necessary precaution given his public profile." "Locked." Poirot's eyes narrowed, tapping the key gently against his chin. "If you locked it, then the judge unlocked it later, received the killer, and locked it again, only to be killed before he could remove the key." "Or," interrupted Vance, his voice laced with venom, "Thorne is lying and left the door open for his accomplice." Poirot ignored the industrialist, his focus solely on the secretary. "You say you hated him, Mr. Thorne. But hatred is a heavy burden. It consumes. Did you wish him dead?" Thorne met his gaze. "Monsieur Poirot, every soul who ever crossed that man's courtroom wished him dead. But no, I did not kill him. I simply survived him. And now I must survive the suspicion." "Admirable frankness," Poirot acknowledged, turning to the Countess. "Lady Beatrice, you occupied the adjacent cabin. Did you hear anything, a sound, a scuffle, a sudden cry?" The Countess sniffed, drawing her fur shawl tighter. "My hearing is impeccable, monsieur. I heard nothing. Only the train's clatter, which stopped, and the wind, that mournful sound." Poirot returned to the central paradox of the locked door, tapping the key again. "The key is in the lock. The killer did not take it. The killer did not leave through the bolted window or the bolted connecting door. Therefore, the killer is not a ghost, Finch. The killer is a master of misdirection, a manipulator of physics. And they have left the greatest clue of all, not in the room, but in our perception of the lock." He paused, letting the implication settle on the terrified passengers. "Someone," Poirot announced, placing the key back onto the train manager's desk. "Knew that key, that lock, and that door better than the victim himself. It is a detail that unlocks not a cabin, but a motive based on access." The judge's secretary, Julian Thorne, gasped, his composure finally breaking. He covered his mouth with a shaking hand, his eyes wide with a horrifying realization. "Oh, God! You mean the switch?" Chapter 2. Poirot's eyes fixed upon Julian Thorne, the secretary's sudden loss of nerve far more telling than his earlier composure. "The switch, Mr. Thorne? Explain yourself. Do not allow your horror to obscure your logic." Thorne swallowed hard, his gaze darting to the frightened face of Mrs. Sharp and the rigid profile of Mr. Vance. "It is not a switch of persons, Monsieur Poirot, but of a mechanism. The locks on these older carriages, they are simple, heavy brass, but they are also deeply recessed. The judge, he was obsessive about security, paranoid about intruders. He always left his key in the outside lock, but slightly turned, a half-turn clockwise, just enough so the key could still be jiggled out, but the lock itself would be engaged. If you tried to force it with the master key, it jammed. But the porter George found the key lodged on the inside, preventing him from entering," Poirot pointed out. "Exactly," Thorne cried, leaning forward. "That is the switch. The only way to lock the door from the outside with the key remaining on the inside is to use a trick he taught me. You use a thin, flexible piece of wire, a needle, perhaps, through the slit on the inside plate. You push the key from its half-turned position until it fully engages the lock from the inside. Then you withdraw the wire. The lock is engaged, the key is inside, and the door is sealed. You have locked the room and vanished." Poirot lifted a fastidious eyebrow. "Magnificent! A simple, elegant piece of misdirection requiring only the correct tool and intimate knowledge of the victim's specific routine. Who else knew this trick, Mr. Thorne?" The judge's security measure was only secure because of its secrecy, NSCE pas. Thorne shook his head, looking utterly defeated. "Only the judge and myself. I would occasionally use it when he asked me to secure his luggage from the outside after he'd retired." "So, the impossible crime requires someone with your specific knowledge," Poirot concluded, the implication hanging heavy in the stagnant air. "Or someone who watched you." Poirot dismissed Thorne and moved to the elegant dining carriage, where the rest of the passengers were now gathered around a sputtering fire, eyeing each other with suspicion. He selected the next subject, Mr. Silas Vance, the blunt industrialist. Vance did not attempt charm. He was aggressive and defensive. "Look, Poirot, I had motive, yes. Finch ruined my viaduct project, cost me £10 million. But murder, that's amateur hour. I crush people through finance, not foolishness with a knife." "Yet your motive, Mr. Vance, is the freshest," Poirot countered smoothly. "The judge's decision was only finalized last week. Did the judge, perhaps, possess any documents that could damage you further?" Vance sneered. "Everyone thinks Finch was a saint of justice. He was a blackmailer. He had files on everyone, including me, little indiscretions. He threatened to release them unless I paid him off." This revelation was significant. Finch was not just a symbol of justice. He was a corrupted man, adding extortion as a secondary motive for the murder, one that could apply to any of the wealthy passengers. Poirot's attention shifted to Mrs. Evelyn Sharp, still draped in black. Her motive of revenge was public knowledge, but Poirot suspected a hidden layer. "Mrs. Sharp, your husband's suicide was tragic. You blame the judge. But tell me, did you travel alone? Are you perhaps meeting someone in Edinburgh?" Mrs. Sharp's composure cracked slightly. Her eyes, red-rimmed from sorrow or fatigue, flickered. "I am alone, monsieur. I travel to my family in Fife. And you were not, shall we say, financially reliant on your late husband?" Poirot pressed. She looked down, her voice a low murmur. "My husband was a good man, but his affairs were complicated. Finch's ruling left me with nothing but this modest annuity. And debt. And a handsome insurance policy?" Poirot suggested. Mrs. Sharp looked up sharply, her denial too slow. It was complicated. My husband's death brought me freedom from the debt, if not from the grief." Poirot gave a satisfied nod. The widow's grief might conceal greed, a strong, but common, motive. A sudden commotion broke the tense silence. George the porter, directed by a meticulous search order from Poirot, rushed into the carriage, holding a small silver letter opener. "Monsieur Poirot, we found this in the coal scuttle of the next cabin. See, too. It belongs to Lady Beatrice Harrington." Lady Beatrice, the Countess, turned a shade of sickly grey. The letter-opener was elegant, sharp, and smeared with a dark stain. Poirot examined the scuttle. It was full of unused coal, not ash. Someone had thrust the knife deep into the small container. A beautiful discovery, Finch. "A weapon," Poirot declared, "and one with a convenient owner and a compelling motive of saving her son's reputation." He turned to the Countess, who seemed on the verge of fainting. "Lady Beatrice, what say you to this? The weapon found next to your room, belonging to you. Did you use your son's ruin as the perfect cover for your own murderous rage?" The Countess held up a trembling hand. "I swear, monsieur, I do not know how that came to be there. I keep my letter-opener locked in my writing-case. I have not opened the case since boarding." Poirot tapped his chin, observing the panic. The Countess was a prime suspect, but the discovery was too neat, too conveniently placed in the coal scuttle, the obvious first hiding-place in a small cabin. He looked past the terrified Countess and towards the back of the dining carriage, where Mr. Vance had been sitting in the shadows. The industrialist now had an expression of triumphant calculation, swiftly concealed. "The weapon is found, but the motive is not yet fixed," Poirot said softly, ignoring the Countess's protests. "The key was on the inside, meaning the killer left the room sealed. The killer must have used the thorn switch. The only tool subtle enough to perform that precise locking action is something thin, flexible, and often overlooked." Poirot's eyes swept from the bloodied silver letter opener to the elegant, gold-plated pin securing Mrs. Sharp's widow's veil. He focused on the secretary, Julian Thorne, who was now sweating profusely, despite the cold. "Mr. Thorne, when you secured the judge's cabin for him, you always used the same method. But tell me, after you used the wire to switch the key to the inside, what did you do with the wire? Did you throw it out the window, or did you put it back in your pocket?" Thorne's eyes glazed over. He looked not at Poirot, but at the ceiling of the swaying carriage. I always threw it away, monsieur. I dared not keep evidence of the judge's idiosyncrasies." Poirot's voice dropped, ice-cold. "Then you are a fool, Mr. Thorne, because the wire, the very tool of the murder, was not disposed of. It is still on this train. It is still on the victim." Chapter 3. Hercule Poirot returned to cabin C1, the atmosphere of the dining carriage, with its newly discovered weapon, and the secretary's near collapse, now entirely secondary to the cold precision of his task. He was seeking a piece of wire so small it could easily be mistaken for lint or a loose thread, yet it was the key to the impossible exit. Mr. Finch, the train manager, followed him, his face etched with confusion. "Monsieur Poirot, surely we must focus on the Countess. The bloody letter-opener is definitive proof." "Au contraire, Finch," Poirot sighed, pulling on a pair of white kid gloves. "The definitive proof is merely the loudest proof. The little gray cells tell me that the killer required two things, a method of entry/exit, the wire, and a weapon. The killer would never risk carrying both out, thus incriminating themselves immediately. The letter opener is a convenient noise to distract us from the silence of the wire. Poirot knelt beside the body of the judge. Lord Justice Finch, though stabbed repeatedly, was still perfectly dressed beneath his silk gown. Poirot carefully began examining the thick silk cord that cinched the gown at the judge's waist. The cord was a complicated plait of black and gold silk. Poirot's fingers moved with the speed of a watchmaker. At the very end of the cord, where the threads finished in a tight knot, he paused. With the aid of a surgical pair of tweezers he produced from his waistcoat, he meticulously unwound the final 3 turns of thread. Embedded and held taut within the knot, disguised entirely by its fine metallic sheen, was a single 3-inch length of gold wire. It was flexible, razor-thin, and perfectly straight. "Voila," Poirot whispered, lifting the minuscule piece of evidence. "The tool of the crime. The instrument of the Thorn switch. The mechanism used to seal the judge's fate and lock the room from the outside. The killer knew the judge would never notice a slight weight in the cord of a gown he wore every night. He secured the wire in a small, folded envelope. Now, the method is proven. The killer possesses the specific, technical knowledge of the judge's routine, knowledge shared only with Julian Thorn. But the wire does not stab a man. We must return to the matter of the weapon." Poirot directed Finch to retrieve the silver letter opener. Back in the dining carriage, he examined the wounds on the judge's body against the blade. "Observe, Finch. The wounds are deep, clean, and narrow. The silver letter opener is thicker, the handle ornate, and the blade tapers too broadly. The silver opener caused a nasty scratch, perhaps, but the death blows were delivered by a different blade, one more simple, smaller, and easily concealed." He tossed the opener onto the table. "A false trail. Lady Beatrice is terrified, but innocent of murder." As the tension eased slightly on the Countess, it clamped down violently on the 2 remaining primary suspects, Vance and Sharp. Poirot turned his attention to a peripheral piece of evidence that had been overlooked, the judge's reading material. The book he had been reading lay half under the body. It was a rare, leather-bound volume of Roman law. When Finch attempted to retrieve it, he noticed a significant detail. The lower half of the book, which had been beneath the judge's spine, was now wet. "It must be the blood, Monsieur Poirot," Finch whispered, horrified. Poirot shook his head. "The blood is already clotted. No, this wetness is not blood. It is moisture from the snow." The window was sealed. The only source of such moisture would be the outside. Poirot, ignoring the astonished onlookers, pulled back the curtains and carefully scraped the heavy frost from the inner glass. He found a hairline crack in the lower corner of the window pane, hidden by the accumulation of ice. Someone forced this window, but only enough to insert a hand and throw something heavy and wet, Poirot deduced. He looked across the viaduct where the snow fell endlessly. A diversion? Or the disposal of the true weapon? The realization that the killer had risked cracking the window to throw the actual weapon into the abyss of the snowy viaduct confirmed Poirot's belief in the meticulous nature of his quarry. With the technicalities solved, Poirot returned to the psychology. He glanced at the judge's face, frozen in shock. Then he looked at the floor near the judge's head, where his spectacles lay shattered into several pieces. "A man reading at night needs his glasses," Poirot murmured. For them to be shattered like this, he must have been struck with tremendous force immediately before or during the first blow. A defensive action by the victim, or a shocking surprise. He lifted a tiny, curved fragment of gold metal that had been part of the spectacle's frame. He addressed the room, his voice calm but heavy with finality. The killer possessed the technical knowledge of Mr. Thorn. The killer had a deeply personal motive involving both money and reputation, involving both Mr. Vance and Mrs. Sharp. The killer had the physical rage to shatter the judge's spectacles with a powerful blow. Poirot looked directly at the secretary, Julian Thorn, who now seemed terrified beyond speech. "Mr. Thorn, You lied when you said you threw the wire away. You kept it on the man who taught you the trick. But why? Thorne could only stammer. Because, Poirot answered his own question, the judge was killed at close, intimate quarters. His glasses were knocked from his nose by a familiar gesture, an angry swipe. And when he was stabbed, his last dying act was not to scream, but to clutch out. He clutched out, Mr. Thorne, and he tore something off his killer, something vital that the killer would immediately miss. Poirot stepped back, his eyes trained on the assembled suspects, specifically at the sleeve of Mrs. Sharp's black dress. Finch retrieved the judge's right hand, carefully. In his rigor mortis grip, I predict you will find not blood or fabric, but a final, damning piece of evidence that reveals the killer was someone the judge did not fear at all, but rather someone he trusted implicitly until the very last second. The train manager, dreading what he might find, reluctantly unfolded the judge's fingers. Clutched tightly in the deceased's hand was a small, ornate cufflink, solid gold, engraved with the initials S.V. Mr. Silas Vance, the millionaire industrialist, stood up so fast his chair crashed to the floor, his face white with terror. Chapter 4. The sheer terror in Silas Vance's eyes as the train manager held up the gold cufflink, engraved clearly with the initials S.V., was palpable. The industrialist struggled violently, his denial a choked, frantic shout. "A lie. I tell you, a lie. I lost that months ago. A plant. That secretary. He hates me. He planted it." Poirot allowed the chaos to subside, letting the full weight of the physical evidence bear down on the industrialist. The gold wire had confirmed the method of escape. The cufflink confirmed the identity of one person who had been in the locked room. "Silence, Mr. Vance," Poirot ordered, his voice cutting through the panic like a blade. "Your rage is magnificent, but it obscures the logic. The clasp of this cufflink contains silk threads torn from Lord Finch's dressing gown. It was not lost weeks ago. It was torn off by the judge in his death struggle. You were there." Vance finally ceased struggling, his chest heaving, his face slick with sweat. He looked from the cufflink to the shattered spectacles, and his immense denial crumbled into a ragged admission. Yes, I was there. But I did not kill him. I swear it on my mother's grave." Poirot raised a calm hand. "Then tell the truth, Mr. Vance. The whole truth. The half-truth is always the most dangerous lie." The industrialist, defeated, sank into a chair. "I had a debt to settle, a massive one. Finch was blackmailing me, threatening to expose my unethical dealings during the war, things that would ruin my reputation entirely. I knew his security trick. I bribed Thorne for the details, and he gave me the wire he was meant to throw away." Julian Thorne, the secretary, gasped in outrage. "That is a lie. He threatened me." Poirot silenced them both with a glance. "Continue, Mr. Vance." "I used the wire. I opened the door from the outside, stepped in, and sealed it behind me. I went to retrieve the file from his desk. He woke up, grabbed his spectacles, and came at me. We fought. I hit him. Yes, I struck him across the face, knocking his glasses off, and he tore the cufflink from my wrist. I panicked. I retrieved the documents, and I fled. I used the wire again to switch the key back to the inside and sealed the room." "And the judge? He was still alive?" "Stunned, perhaps bleeding, but alive." "I swear it, Monsieur Poirot. I only meant to retrieve my property." Vance's confession shifted the timeline, but not the crime. The room was locked, the judge was alive when Vance left, and the judge was found dead later. The impossible crime was solved. The lock was rigged by someone with specific knowledge, but the murder itself was still unsolved. Poirot returned to the evidence of the true weapon. If Vance was telling the truth, the killer entered after him, finished the job, and then disposed of the murder weapon. Poirot focused on the hairline crack in the window, examining the exterior condensation with a magnifying glass. The moisture was not just snow, It was mixed with a sticky residue. The killer did not merely throw the weapon out, Poirot mused, addressing the room. They threw something that could be disguised as a common object, which the storm then carried away. But the murder weapon itself must be small, sharp, and disposable. He looked at Mrs. Evelyn Sharp, the bereaved widow, who had watched the confrontation with unnerving stillness. She fit the psychological profile for the familiar gesture, a sharp, personal blow. Mrs. Sharp, your late husband's tragedy was well known. But Lord Finch, he was not merely your judge, n'est-ce pas? You had another relationship with him. One of the heart, or perhaps one of the sheets. Mrs. Sharp's composure finally fractured. She rose, clutching her black lace collar. "How dare you?" "I dare because the truth is always a tangled knot of passion and finance," Poirot stated. "Your husband's bankruptcy, the tragedy, was merely the stage dressing. Your true relationship with Finch was that of a lover he tired of and cast aside." Poirot's eyes dropped to the elegant, beaded purse Mrs. Sharp clutched. "When Mr. Vance left the judge merely stunned, you were waiting. Perhaps you followed Vance, or perhaps you were already in the adjacent cabin, listening. You entered, found the judge momentarily incapacitated, and you delivered a death blow that was personal, intimate, and furious." Poirot stepped toward her, his eyes fixed on the purse. "Mrs. Sharp, open your purse. Show me the small, specialized object you use for writing notes or securing your garments. Show me the object that could deliver repeated, narrow wounds." Mrs. Sharp's face turned white. She backed away, her grip tightening on the beaded bag. The murder weapon was not the silver letter opener, nor was it thrown into the viaduct. The actual weapon was concealed in the one place no one would ever search, a lady's garments, Poirot deduced, his voice a low, terrifying accusation. "You used a long, specialized hatpin, razor-sharp, capable of deep penetration, and easily cleaned and slipped back into your bodice. The residue on the window, Finch?" "That was merely a small packet of the judge's blackmail papers that Mrs. Sharp threw out, creating a second false trail to point toward Vance." The widow, realizing her secret life was entirely exposed, shrieked and threw the purse at the detective. It hit the wall, spilling its contents, a handkerchief, a lipstick, a few pound notes, and one ornate, silver hatpin, its point stained a faint, rust-brown. "He deserved it!" Mrs. Sharp screamed, her elegance gone, replaced by raw, desperate venom. "He ruined my husband. He ruined me. He promised me marriage, then laughed and called me a desperate fool. The moment Vance left, I saw my chance to wipe the debt clean, once and for all." Constable Harling, who had been listening with astonished concentration, moved to restrain her. Poirot, however, shook his head sadly, watching the desperate, sobbing figure. A crime of convenience, built upon a foundation of ancient bitterness. "But, Mrs. Sharp, your passion was a lie, and your weapon, though deadly, was merely the instrument of your rage." He looked past her, toward the train manager and the now horrified faces of the other suspects. "The murder is solved, the killer caught. But the motive is not yet complete. The deepest crime, the most heinous betrayal, has not been by the woman, nor the industrialist, nor the secretary, but by the one person whose motive remains untouched by the visible evidence, the Countess of Ashworth. Chapter 5. The silence that fell after Mrs. Sharp's frenzied confession was immediately shattered by Lady Beatrice Harrington. The elderly Countess rose, her face parchment white, her dignity a fragile shield. "This is grotesque, Monsieur Poirot. I had my grievances, yes. But to suggest I am connected to that hysterical creature's savage act is an insult to my entire family." "Your family, madam," Poirot said, walking slowly towards the Countess, his hands clasped behind his back, "is precisely the issue. Every motive we have uncovered, revenge, blackmail, greed, is merely a small coin. Your motive, I fear, is the entire treasury." Poirot lifted the small, empty envelope containing the gold wire. The judge was not only obsessed with security, but with control. He collected secrets. Mr. Vance's cufflink confirms a struggle for his life, but the judge's last, most crucial act was not tearing off Mr. Vance's property. It was securing his own. Poirot directed Finch to the judge's writing desk again. This time, he pointed to a sleek, heavy fountain pen. It was expensive, German-made, and still capped. The judge never traveled without this pen. Finch examined the mechanism. Gently. Finch, with trembling hands, twisted the cap not to load ink, but to reveal a tiny, concealed compartment within the barrel. Inside, lodged tightly, were several delicate microfilm negatives. "These are not just documents, madam," Poirot announced, holding the negatives up to the dim carriage light. "These are the proof, the photographic evidence of your late husband's activities during the Great War. They confirm that the founder of the Ashworth dynasty was not a decorated war hero, but a man who engaged in espionage and treason for financial gain. Lord Finch was not merely blackmailing your son. He was threatening to destroy the very name and honor of the Ashworth line." The Countess swayed, her hand flying to her throat. The color drained from her cheeks, confirming the terrible truth. "When you heard the scuffle next door, you did not call for help, madam. You unbolted the connecting door, believing the noise was Vance attempting to steal this very microfilm. You found the judge injured, his spectacles shattered, but still alive and reaching for his pen. You realized Vance had failed to kill him, and you knew that if the judge survived, your family's destruction was assured. So you acted," Poirot concluded, his voice ringing with conviction. "You used your own silver letter opener, the weapon we conveniently found in the coal scuttle, and you inflicted a wound, intending to silence him and grab the microfilm. You placed the opener in the coal scuttle to frame the first viable suspect, Mr. Vance, whom you despised for his vulgar greed." Lady Beatrice finally collapsed into her seat, the weight of a lifetime of concealed betrayal crushing her. I only wanted to protect the memory. I had to secure the negatives." "Indeed," Poirot nodded. "You committed attempted murder and theft. But your blow, though malicious, was not the death blow. It was superficial. You then took the microfilm, the true prize, and retreated, bolting the connecting door behind you. Only moments later, Mrs. Sharp, driven by a simpler, more immediate rage, entered the same cabin and delivered the final, fatal blows with her hatpin." Poirot surveyed the stunned faces, the industrialist arrested for blackmail and assault, the secretary complicit in providing the means of entry, the widow arrested for murder, and the esteemed countess arrested for attempted murder and treasonous concealment. 3 people attempted to kill that judge, all within a span of 10 minutes, each driven by a different layer of his villainy. Mr. Vance wanted his money, Mrs. Sharp wanted revenge for her broken heart, and Lady Beatrice wanted the preservation of a lie. Finch was not killed by one motive, but by the accumulated hatred of the entire train. As the sun began to breach the horizon, turning the blinding white snow into fields of pale gold, the snowploughs finally reached the viaduct. The rhythmic clatter of the train's wheels, a sound of movement and purpose, returned. Poirot stood on the platform, meticulously dusting a single flake of snow from his sleeve. He handed the now secured microfilm negatives and the recovered weapons, the hatpin and the gold wire, to the arriving chief inspector. "A terrible harvest, my friend," Poirot remarked, watching as Lady Beatrice was led away, her head held high in brittle pride. The Frostbridge Express was not a train tonight. It was a psychological pressure cooker, proving that a man's sins, no matter how old, will always catch up to him, sometimes all at once. The inspector nodded grimly. "You solved the impossible crime, Monsieur Poirot, and you found the killer. Who do we charge?" "Charge all of them," Poirot advised, climbing into a waiting motor car, ready for the long drive to London. "But remind the jury that it was not the industrialist's greed, nor the Countess's treason, but the bitter, final fury of a woman scorned that delivered the final, fatal blow. She had the passion. The others merely provided the opportunity. And that brings the chilling case of the murder on the Frostbridge Express to a close. The judge's death wasn't just a crime, but a tragic reckoning where three separate betrayals converged in a single, fatal moment. If the elegant deduction of Poirot and the dark secrets hidden beneath the snow on the Frostbridge viaduct captivated your imagination, you'll love what else we have waiting for you. Don't let the mystery end here. Be sure to like this video and subscribe to Mysteries and Roses for more classic Golden Age crime fiction and sharp-witted detective stories delivered every week. What was the most shocking betrayal for you? Let us know in the comments below. Until the next mystery unfolds, keep those little gray cells sharp. Good night.